Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for being here. We're going to start in a couple minutes. In the meantime, I encourage you all to please introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us where you're calling in from. It'd be great to know who's all in the room here. I see Idaho and New York and all over Minnesota. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to give it one more minute. All right, let's dive in. We can get my part out of the way so you can hear from the experts. Thank you all, everybody, for joining us today. My name's Natalie Hennigan, and I'm with Rethos, which is the host of this event series, Deconstruction Masterclass. If you joined us last week for the first series or for the first panel in this series, you can ignore the next few slides because I'm just going to do the same spiel. But for those who are new to Rethos, I'd like to introduce us first. Rethos is a regional nonprofit organization headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota. And our mission is to lead and inspire people to connect to places promoting community vitality. Essentially, what we do is we help people and communities reuse and care for their old buildings. For example, our policy staff advocates for legislation and ordinances that make it easier to reuse and care for old buildings. Our Main Street program worked with communities throughout greater Minnesota to help them revitalize their historic downtown districts. And our education program teaches people how to repair and maintain old buildings. Our education program has a really strong focus on reuse and sustainability. We teach our communities and our students about basic repair techniques, really so that they can rely on their own skills and affordably fix up their old homes. And we try to promote practices like salvage and deconstruction to ensure that high quality materials stay in use and out of the landfill. So we host hands-on workshops, webinars, talks, and panel series like this one year-round. And you can find all of our upcoming programs, register for all of them at rethos.org. This panel series is funded in part by a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, for which we are very grateful. If you haven't already, please sign up for the one remaining session next week on May 18th, where we're going to talk about the relationship between deconstruction and historic preservation, particularly how advocates in both of these fields can help each other out, can advocate for each other, and how salvaged material can be advantageous to ongoing preservation projects. If you missed last week's session, that has been recorded and will be available on our website soon for your future reference. So a few reminders for today. We ask that you please stay muted throughout the presentations and use the chat feature in Zoom for your questions. This first hour or so will be presentations from our panelists. We'll take a quick break and then we'll have some discussion and Q&A. If you would like to turn on closed captions, you can click live transcript at the bottom right of your screen and then click show subtitles. And I see a lot of you are already introducing yourselves in the chat. Please, share where you're calling in from. As I shared last week, in my experience, deconstruction has advanced in Minnesota because of networking opportunities, chances to meet people from other sectors, and partner and get to know them. So please do get to know each other. So last week we offered an introduction to deconstruction, what it is and what's going on in Minnesota. And our panelists today are going to dive into some of the climate and environmental impacts of deconstruction as an alternative to building demolition. So we'll talk about waste diversion, carbon emissions, hazardous materials, and we're going to feature an example from the city of Northfield, Minnesota, about their zero waste plan, which includes stipulations for deconstruction. So I'm very grateful for our panelists today. We have Jason Allen from Better Futures Minnesota, Colin Boyson from Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and Matt Roan from the City of Northfield Climate Action Plan's Material and Waste Work Group, also a retired St. Olaf College professor. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to kick us off. I'll give you a little bit more info about Jason. He's a project manager for Better Futures Minnesota and is currently managing their statewide waste diversion project to divert 15,000 tons of solid waste from the state's 42 landfills. Also working to expand the use of reclaimed materials and create jobs all about reuse, repurposing, and recycling. Jason is a strong believer in the power of relationships and is a powerful force in the workplace, utilizing his positive attitude and energy to encourage employees to create favorable outcomes. We're so lucky to have Jason here today. I will let you take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie. All right, so as Natalie said, we're looking at deconstruction as an alternative to demolition. And when we look at demolition, it's a problem. If we go to the next slide, we can kind of talk through that a little bit. And one thing with my panelists, Colin, and also Joe Bauman from Kraus Anderson, who was on the last panel, one of the problems that we have with demolition is it's what we've always done. And as we kind of go through this, we'll see that we're slow to change because, again, it's what we've always done. With demolition, it's quick, efficient, and cheap. And a lot of times when we're looking at the removal of a building or a structure, it's all about efficiency and the bottom line. So we really got to start thinking about changing how we look at that. And one of the problems with demolition is the majority of those building materials are buried in the landfills. There's a couple things with that. There is opportunity lost because we're not, the building materials that are being buried could have further use somewhere else. And it's also an opportunity to create additional revenue streams for people who are reselling, repurposing, and reusing those building materials. And some of the data that I have, it's a little dated, but the impact is still there. 9 years later, we're still having this conversation about deconstruction, recycling, and reuse, and trying to increase those numbers. So in 2013, there was 1.6 million tons of construction waste that was generated in Minnesota. And of that 1.6 million, only 18% was diverted from the landfills. And as Colin will talk about, there's that gap between outstate Minnesota and the metro. In that time, only 6% of that building materials was diverted in outstate initiatives and 30% in the metro. So a little bit better in the metro. We'll go to the next slide. Another topic for today is the environmental impact. The greenhouse gases that are created by building materials dumping is huge. So of that 1.3 million tons of building materials in the landfills, it produced 3.7 metric tons of CO2 emissions. And so as Colin will talk about, it's a lot of times, we think about a us problem, but it's a bigger problem than that. And so when we're doing this, we're impacting the environment. And so we want to look at ways to try and lessen that impact. Next slide, please. And so when we look at those greenhouse gases, that's the equivalent of 787,000 passenger vehicles, 341,000 home energy use for the year, and 3 million acres of forest used to sequester that carbon. Next slide, please. And so, as you see, there are a lot of benefits to the habitat for, excuse me, you guys, for cutting down on those gases. Next slide, please. And so what is the alternative? Deconstruction, the new practice and policy. Next slide, please. And so why deconstruction? As other slides that I've kind of breezed through talked about their substantial environmental impacts, but also the social benefits to families and community, whether it's health concerns for those who have heart and lung disease, or being able to reuse those building materials and increase, again, the life cycle of those products, as well as new revenue streams. And then as Colin will talk about, or we had talked about also in a previous conversation, demolition is not a sustainable practice. The landfills are finite. There's only so much space and so much stuff that we can put into these landfills. Next slide, please. And so if you weren't on the panel last week, how it works. In practice, and it seems real simple. Deconstruction is the systematic disassembling of a building in a safe and methodical manner. And we want to preserve the reusable materials, recycle most of those remaining materials, remove all the way down to the foundation and clear for the next use. And what we do at Better Futures is we try to reclaim up to 80 to 90% of those building materials, and we sell them either online or in our warehouse. And I'll do a little plug right now. If you've never been to our warehouse, we have a reuse warehouse that's open to the public at 2620 Minnehaha Avenue in Minneapolis. And we sell these reclaimed building materials from flooring, doors, windows, anything that can go into a building, we have in our warehouse. Next slide, please. And so when we look at how it used to be done compared to how it can be done, when you look at reuse versus recycling, reuse has 5 times the impact of recycling alone. Next slide, please. So we look at statewide versus local. So in that time, we're currently working at a practice of recycling 18% of the building materials, with the goal being 70% recycle and 15% reuse. So if you look at these numbers, being able to get reuse in there into the equation and increasing what we're recycling will have a great impact on the environment. Next slide, please. As we talked about that gap between outstate and the metro area. So in 2014, we did there was 130 houses demolished just in Edina. And if you look at what the current practice was of, again, 30% being recycled in the metro area versus what we could have done had we had 70% recycle and 15% reuse, the impact would have been dramatic. And so one thing that really stuck out to me was the savings of the forest acreage. 5,000 acres of forest would have been saved by sequestering those CO2 gases. That's half the size of Edina. I mean, it's pretty crazy when you look at those numbers like that. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, one of the things that we want to do is really kind of change the way people are thinking. Demolition has always been the easy way to do things, and wrapping our heads around doing it a little bit differently and saving money is something that is going to take time, but it's conversations like this that continue to make those things move forward. Natalie, I know it's kind of quick.
Thank you, Jason. I think that we're going to have a lot of questions, though, too, about Better Futures work, and I hope you can expand on that, too, when we get to more discussion. But I want to thank you for that. I especially love the equivalencies to emissions from X number of cars driving on the road or whatever. I think that even when I first got into the historic preservation field, one of the most compelling arguments for saving a building in full was equating it to, say, you know, its weight or volume in terms of aluminum cans recycled or something like that, which sometimes we need these really tangible visualizations of what we're talking about to convince us to make change. So thank you for sharing those examples. I think that's really valuable. And we all know it takes a lot of different, I think we all glom on to different parts of the argument, you know, to make a case. So
exactly.
that's helpful.
I'm sorry, and as you point that out, and to put that in, you know, as we talk about, you know, looking at those comparables. So, you know, it talked about 1.9 or 1.3 million tons. You know, so our project is to divert 15,000 tons. And, you know, as I'm looking at that number over the next 2 years, that seems like a daunting task. And just so in the first quarter of this year, through our deconstruction projects, our recycling and our other waste diversion measures through our warehouse here in Minneapolis, we've diverted about an average of 45,000 tons. And so 45,000 tons is a small drop in the bucket. I mean, we really need to be averaging around 300 tons a month. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, we're looking to take the practices that we've started doing here and taking them outstate. And when you look at 15,000 tons over the course of 2 years, that is really a drop in the bucket compared to 1.3 million tons that was diverted, that was created in 1 year. And so, you know, when you look at it, I mean, we've got a big job ahead of us.
You might have seen the question pop up in the chat if Better Futures does work outstate. Maybe,
yes.
maybe you can project into the future of it. But
yes, great. So, so we do. So we have done a few projects outstate. We did last year in 2020, we did 5 projects in the Duluth area, deconstruction projects. And then we've also started working with on our waste diversion project, and it may come up further in this discussion, but we've partnered with Becker County. And so we've gone actually to their landfill and have done some diverting. We're actually pulling materials out of the waste stream and then trying to resell them. So yeah, so we are state. So we have been able to do deconstruction projects outside of the metro.
Thanks, Jason. Awesome. And we'll get to more questions of Jason after our other panelists present their content. So I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Colin Boyson. Colin has been working in the asbestos industry for 22 years. He started in the private industry as a consultant, performing inspections and air monitoring, which evolved into active abatement work. He joined the Minnesota Department of Health in 2012 as a compliance inspector and risk assessor with their asbestos and lead unit. And in 2019, he hopped over to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and took over the asbestos program. So Colin is going to talk about all these scary materials for the next little bit here. Thank you, Colin.
You bet. So I'm not gonna lie, I don't have the numbers that Jason does, but feel free to email me. I'll have all my contact information at the end. But again, I am the asbestos program for the agency right now. I'm working to build it a little bit. So next slide. So this is kind of our vision, you know, clean air, water, land, support health communities and ecosystems, and have a strong economy in Minnesota. So that's kind of our vision as an agency. Next slide. So what we'll talk about today are the current methods for how we deal with, you know, buildings being removed, different waste streams, landfill capacities, planning, and then progression. Next slide. So the current methods for getting rid of buildings, there's the inspection versus no inspection, and this deals more with commercial versus residential. The NESHAP program, the federal NESHAP program, guides our program, and that's what we run, is the federal NESHAP, which requires asbestos inspections on all commercial demolition activities. It is not applied to residential in the state of Minnesota. Currently, there are 2 counties, Hennepin County and Ramsey County, are working to do ordinances within their county rules to force that same requirements. They would have to do an inspection and remove all asbestos prior to demolitions of residential properties. That's currently not the case. The Department of Health oversees or has authority over residential demolitions, because we do not, as the Pollution Control Agency doesn't oversee residential, only commercial. As far as demolition goes, there's a straight demo where they roll up with the backhoe, knock the building down and haul it all the way. There's the training burns that the fire departments often run. I didn't realize how frequent they were until I came over here, but we do see a lot of fire department training burns in order to train the fire department, but also to get rid of buildings. That's something that we see quite a bit, and we deal a lot with enforcement on burned buildings, especially in the rural areas of Minnesota where it's the way things are done, the way things have always been done, and trying to change that mentality is something that I'm working on, as well as our solid waste program, to get out there with the counties, out there with the smaller communities to discuss why that they can't do that anymore. There's also the permit by rule, which allows a property to be inspected, asbestos gets removed, and then they can knock it down and bury it on site. But we are pushing hard to remove that from our policy. We don't like to see that. We want to get away from that, because every one of those permit by rules has to be monitored, has to be notarized and set up with the county so we know where those are. So it is something we're actively trying to dissuade people from using where we can. Next slide. Waste streams. This is a big one that a lot of folks don't understand. When they see a dumpster at a construction site, they think, it's garbage, everyone can go in there. What they fail to recognize is that there are different landfills that only accept certain materials. So you got your mixed solid waste, which is your homeowner stuff, more of your household materials, non-hazardous materials, couches, chairs, things of that nature. You've got your industrial, which is your demolition landfills, your construction demolition landfills, your asbestos landfills, combustion ash. Then you've got your hazardous landfills, which are more your radioactives, your very dangerous chemicals. And we actually don't have any hazardous waste landfills in the state of Minnesota. The closest one is Illinois. So we do keep that stuff moving along if we can. We don't want that stationed here. Then we get into the transfer stations where a contractor can bring the stuff to a central location where it can be sourced, separated there, and then shipped out to landfills. Transfer stations are required to be permitted. So a lot of construction companies will have a quote unquote area where they'll bring all the stuff back to, and they'll source it there. They're not allowed to do that if they don't have a permit for it. So we do actively try and shut those down because we don't want that stuff happening. And then the recycling centers where you bring things for recycling. But that's kind of the general waste streams. And as we're deconstructing homes and demolishing homes, we've got a lot of that mixed solid waste and the demolition waste, which we're trying to separate and get to the right location. So when we see dumpsters on site, it's important for them to understand that not everything can go in the same dumpster. And we talked about this, a smaller group with Jason, Matt, and Natalie and I, about incentivizing that program. Some landfills have started doing that, where they'll give a discount to a contractor that brings in a clean dumpster that's just got the clean demolition material in it. We'll give you a discount on 10% off for every clean dumpster you bring in. But if you bring in a bad one that's got mixed solid waste in with it, that we've got to now separate the landfill, we're going to charge you extra for that. And the reason they got to separate is because if us as enforcement people come out, we're going to cite the landfill. They're going to get a penalty from us, a monetary penalty for accepting materials that are not permitted to be in their landfill. So they've gotten really good about it. A lot of the contractors appreciate that incentivized program. Not everyone's on board yet, but we do think there's some potential there to help get that stuff cleaned out before it hits the landfill and save the landfill some time and energy. Next slide. Permit allowances. Every landfill in the state of Minnesota and transfer station is required to be permitted. And what that permit gives them is an allowance of what they can accept and how much of it on an annual basis they're allowed to take in. So there are limits to what a landfill can take in over the course of a year. Now, obviously, if a natural disaster happens and they have to accept more stuff than they're permitted, we'll make allowances for it, but it's on a need basis. It's not something we just go, whenever you want, take whatever you can. There are limits to that. And that also gets into the cubic footage. There's only so much space in the landfills. We are a finite capacity. So the more stuff they have to take in and bury, and if you look around at everything you see, everything at some point is going to end up in a landfill. And that's a lot. I mean, just drive down to any major city, even a small city if you want. all that construction material, everything is going to be in the landfill at some point. And how do we have the capacity for that? We currently do not. So that's where it's important for us to understand that. And also the airspace in landfills. When they compact that stuff down, it takes up airspace between that. So that's why these compactors to get more room, to get more stuff in there. But when you throw in mattresses, and now we're starting to deal with a lot of those windmill blades, those big wind turbine blades, those eat up space. And how are we dealing with that? That's a big problem we have going on right now down by the South Dakota, Iowa, southern Minnesota border, where we've got all those wind farms dealing with the blades that are now at their 25-year limit and they need to be replaced and removed. Dealing with them has become a huge issue, and we're still struggling with what the best method is going to be. But again, we have a finite amount of space for all this material. So what do we do? Next slide. So the big thing is planning. We got to shift in the business. We've got to look at what Jason's doing with his company and how they're trying to transition to reclamation. What can we take out of these buildings before we knock them down? What can we reuse? What products can we have? And then, using again. But that's requires some training, because deconstructing buildings is not the same as swinging a sledgehammer. You have to have some skill, and it's not a huge technical skill, but they do need some identified training so they understand how to do things safely so they can reuse that material. There is a little bit in there. Inspection identification, having the people that understand this is something we can reuse, this is valuable. I can inspect a building and I can understand what am I looking for that I can reuse out of that building. And that does take some training as well. Scheduling and removal, it's not as simple as rolling up with a backhoe and letting your guys go in there. There's some time that needs to be prepared to get that stuff out of there safely, to get it out there without ruining it. And that does take more time than just swinging a sledgehammer or bringing in a backhoe. And then the marketing and sales, having a marketplace for this stuff so that you're spending the time and energy to get the stuff out. Do you have a seller? Do you have a buyer for that material where you can transition it over quickly and not have it stored in a warehouse somewhere for long periods of time where it's not effective? So those are all things that as a community and as a country, we got to start shifting our values here with this. Next slide. So rule changes, impacts on landfill. We are now looking at requiring all demolition landfills to have a liner. What that's going to do is cause a lot of these smaller landfills to shut down because the liners are extremely expensive and they're not going to want to do it. So they're going to say, well, we're done, which again limits the availability of space in the landfills, especially with demolition landfills. And the reason for the liner is to catch what we call leachate. So as the water comes down, the rain comes down and sifts through that debris, it catches and leaches off dangerous materials, chemicals, and things like that we have to collect. The liner collects that instead of letting it go down into the ground, into the water table. It collects it out, and then we can take it to a water treatment center and take care of it. But that's why we want those liners in there, because we have a lot of stuff in these demolition landfills that are not great. And we want to make sure we're not exposing anyone else to it. There's been a huge emphasis on sustainability, recycling and recourse. I should have been reuse, I'm sorry. But recycling materials, but then reusing. And as Jason's slide pointed out, there's a huge impact with reuse versus recycling. You're going to see a much larger return there. And any new opportunities. Where else can we find ways to sustain it and reuse things in a better manner, in a more cost-effective manner? How do we incentivize people to go this route when it is so much cheaper and easier just to bring in the backhoe as opposed to having someone come out and inspect, identify, remove, and go through that whole thing? So there's got to be a shift in thought. And again, the landfill issue is not just a Minnesota issue, it's a nationwide issue. The landfills are filling up at a rapid rate, and there's just not going to be enough space. At some point, it's going to become a problem, and we're already starting to see it a little bit. But here we get an opportunity to be progressive and get ahead of it, to change our thinking, to change the way we're doing business. But it's one of those things where everyone needs to get on board. And this is something that, working for the government, I see this as something we need to really focus on with legislatures, is improving the importance of this. The reuse and sustainability of materials, I think, is hugely important, especially the next probably 10 years. We're going to really need to focus on this and make it a concerted effort to change things. Next slide. So that was the end of my little spiel. I thank you all for attending and being here. And if you have questions, there's my email address and phone number. Feel free to contact me if you need specific numbers on any information. I am not a stat head, so I will find the people that will get you any stats or information needed as current as we can get them. But I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here today and be part of this. And I thank you for coming in and listening.
Thank you so much, Colin. One thing, you spoke a little bit about penalties or incentives at transfer sites or at landfills. And can you speak a little bit more to that? Like, what are some of the common arguments for or against? What are you hearing? What do you think is the right next step?
The incentivization is something that most people don't want to incentivize. They don't want to take a price cut on the loads. They'll penalize, they'll be glad to charge you for cleaning it out. But penalizing someone, it's a carrot and a stick. You penalize them, that tells them I don't want to do that again. But if you incentivize it, it makes them want to do it. It makes them want to do better. If you have that just a little carrot there for them. But the argument is, well, I don't want to lose money on each load, but I'll charge them extra on this one if they bring in something dirty. As a parent with 3 children and soon to be grandchildren, I found that giving my children a little reward was much better than threatening to do something to them. And so that's always been my argument, is give them a little something to reach for and aim for, and they'll always try to get there rather than smack them when they fail. So incentivizing, you get a 10% discount, a 5%, whatever you want. You get a discount every time you bring in a clean dumpster. But if you don't, then you lose that. Then the next one you're paying full price, plus I'm going to charge you a little bit to clean this up. And you'll find that they will do more with it. I'm just looking at some of the comments here too. DNR staff, the DNR does permit the training burns. We generally don't like to see the burns for the removal of properties, but if they want to do training burn, we can't stop them as long as DNR approves it. And they've got a plan in place. Now they can't just go, we're going to bring them out here this weekend. There's a process to it. There's an application. They have to commit it to a plan that has to be submitted. But it is something that I'm seeing a lot more often. And I'm noticing a lot of these volunteer fire departments really aren't familiar with what's required. So we're having some meetings with fire marshals now to try and do some more training with the local fire departments, with the volunteer guys and gals, to help them understand what they need to be doing, what they really need to be doing to do this correctly, so that it's beneficial to them, because there's a benefit. If you don't deal with fires a lot and all of a sudden you got one, it's nice to have some hands-on experience of how to handle it. So we see value there, but we also don't want them going around torching every empty building in the county. That's not something that we want to see either. As far as the blade materials, yeah, they can't be recycled because it's a composite of wood, fiberglass, and resin. So they tried to shred them, but it ruins the shredders. It gums up the shredders so bad. So shredding is really not much of an option. I know down in Iowa, they're looking at vertical disposal. So they'll put the blades in vertically in the ground. We're talking cutting them down into, I think they said thirds or fourths, to try and get them in that way. And they think they can get more buried that way, and that would allow the water to run off easier. But we're talking thousands of blades over there, especially in that small corner of the state and along that 3-state corridor. There's just so much. And they have about a 25-year life expectancy, and they're all at that rate right now where all these blades are going to be coming in. And there's just no real good way to handle them yet. So we're still fighting that battle with what's the best step. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've literally never thought about what happens to wind turbine blades after that's fascinating and important. So, wow.
Yeah, they've got a huge lead weight on the end of them too. So you got to take that hunk of lead off and deal with that. And then you got to deal with the blades themselves. So it's a huge thing, and it's going to be a big problem over the next couple of years with how to deal with them. So.
Wow. Well, thank you, Colin. I have more questions for you once we get to our Q&A portion.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We're gonna move on to Matt Roan, who I'm pleased to introduce. Matt is a retired St. Olaf College environmental humanities professor. and Northfield Environmental Citizen Volunteer. For those not from Minnesota, Northfield is a community in Minnesota, about 45 minutes south of the Twin Cities. Matt co-chaired the city's Climate Action Plan's Material and Waste Work Group when it helped write the recently passed Zero Waste Plan that the CAP requires. He also served as the city's liaison for several St. Olaf student groups who undertook academic civic engagement projects in a course that was offered twice during the academic year that the Zero Waste Plan was being written. Their projects helped inform the plan and involved the college in hiring contractors to deconstruct and demolish about a dozen houses on St. Olaf's campus. He and Professor Paul Jackson led a session at the National Deconstruction and Reuse Conference last year on the usefulness of academic civic engagement for such municipal tasks. I had the pleasure of moderating that presentation as well. So I'm grateful for Matt's contribution to this work, and I'm glad you all can hear from him. Matt, take it away.
Great, thanks a lot, Natalie. In November 2019, the city of Northfield passed a really ambitious climate action plan that you can find on at the city's website. I'm not seeing chat, but I hope that added into chat I gave the URL for it and the Zero Waste Plan. Among the things that it called for was a zero waste plan within 3 years. And we just wrote that, and City Council approved it this past March. Within the zero waste plan, there's a whole section on construction and demolition that calls for major increases in deconstruction. The city hasn't posted this on its own website yet, but the link I hope has shown up will get you to a near final draft of it. And within it, there are also a number of recommendations. You can see the statistics that Jason gave you that we introduced this section with of the MPCA's information on 80% of that 1.6 million tons that Jason brought up really could be diverted from landfills. And so we're eager to see that ourselves. I'll come back to the recommendations that we have, but I just want to give people some sense of context. For those of you familiar with Minnesota, Northfield is on the very north edge of Rice County. In fact, this dated map doesn't show it, but we have fingers of Northfield that drift over into Dakota County. And for those who aren't from Minnesota, Dakota County is one of the metropolitan area counties, and they're under their own regulations, tighter regulations when it comes to handling of waste materials, and are doing a lot more because of bigger problems with waste stream issues. So we have that value of being a rural community of sorts, but also being right on the edge and being able to take advantage of some of the resources that are in the metro area. Our landfill is about halfway between Northfield and another larger city in Rice County, Faribault. So right here, notice that the Cannon River runs right by the landfill as well. And that landfill has a demolition site. Northfield itself, even though we go into Dakota County, is governed by Rice County disposal rules, and its landfill at current rates of disposal is expected to be full by 2036, and there are presently no plans whatsoever for what to do after that. So a problem many communities are facing that we're talking about. We're also very fortunate that we have two colleges in Northfield, and each of them has involved itself in demolition. So this began a few years back when St. Olaf College employed some deconstruction practices to what's called the Ole Avenue project that's presently under construction. And this, you heard about how a group of students looked into this. This is the former house for the president that was completely deconstructed. And then these are older 19th century houses for the most part, turn of the 20th century houses that were student honor houses that now subsequently have been deconstructed. In fact, the entire site is pretty much nearing the end of construction. So groups of students in that environmental studies class researched the decision-making behind this and some of the outcomes, and we used some of that research in developing the city's zero waste plan. And then more recently, Carleton College was ready to tear down a concert hall, art gallery, adjacent theater, and a classroom for its music department. All of this had moved over to another part of campus in new structures. And they decided to not only use deconstruction for this project and actually contracted with Better Futures to do it, but they wanted to use this as a pilot project to convince the college at large that this should be the practice going forward at Carleton College as part of what it has as a very ambitious and serious net zero climate action plan. This is really the first time they've moved into looking at demolition and deconstruction. So this is also carefully kind of cataloged and studied in terms of amounts of recovery and the value of that. And there's great hope that it will succeed in making this the regular practice. Having big entities like this doing deconstruction and understanding the value of deconstruction, we hope will be of great value in Northfield of convincing the community at large that this is something that is possible to adopt, because I think some people don't even think it is, well, you know, this sounds like it's going to create so many problems and be so expensive and all, and why would we even want to do this? But also kind of lead them into saying, oh, these major practitioners are doing it. We should at least look into this quite seriously, learn from them. And we're also hoping that, you know, as you have more people doing this, then it becomes easier to do. The resources are more readily apparent, more readily available. The better practices get shared more. And so that's one of the values of this. So as you can see, if you look down at the bottom of the left side there, the zero waste plan that Northfield adopted has 14 recommendations in the construction and demolition section of the zero waste plan. I won't go through all of them, but a few of them, you know, number one, develop metrics-based guidelines to reduce the amount of construction and demolition materials that go into landfills is one of the things we hope to accomplish. Consider ordinance changes, number two, enter changes to building permits to require the use of recycling of a portion of construction and demolition. And that's obviously something that's gonna only be able to take place down the line as we get more buy-in and understanding of why you would do this. Consider working, number four, with neighboring towns to create a regional reuse facility for construction materials. And actually the MPCA has helped fund a remarkable program in Becker County, where Becker County's own landfill has set up a reuse and has us kind of excited about what we might be able to do in Rice County. Number 10, work with contractors and others to develop ordinance changes to required increased use of recycled materials during construction process. And we're very interested in communities that are, as Colin was talking about, using incentives as much as disincentives to get more of that type of activity as these sorts of things get created. Number 11, create a green building policy that provides incentives to attract developers, higher development ratios, lower setbacks or credits for use of materials made from recycled content, and for on-site reuse and recycling. And number 12, eventually charge a deposit for permitted projects that's refundable if the permittee meets the set higher standard of materials recovery. So you can kind of monetize some of those incentives. And then 14, develop internal policy requiring deconstruction rather than demolition of all city buildings set to be torn down. And even though that's down at number 14, in general, as we've been moving forward on the climate action plan, we've set the city as providing the example and not imposing upon others what the city itself is not willing to do as more of a first step rather than a late or last step. And definitely the overriding goal of all of this is to normalize deconstruction over demolition. I myself wonder how long it will take for us to actually get that in place. The more I learn about this, the more I see the value of it. I mean, just not only value, but real importance of it, but also am well aware of how foreign it is to people, and it's been brought up how much people want to say, oh, tearing a building down is so much faster and easier and less expensive. I don't even want to think about this other route. But we know that it can valuably contribute to the pressing sustainability goals that are outlined in the climate action plan, and that society has to come to terms with sooner rather than later. So I look forward to questions. And
thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate your point about if big entities like a college campus adopt, more deconstruction into their long-term planning, perhaps that momentum can help bring along the general public around stuff like that. I think Melissa Wenzel and I have chatted about, what if the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, had a similar strategy for all of the buildings in state park and forest lands, and what if these large groups or entities, actually led the way on this. So thank you for sharing those examples. And I'd love to hear more too about St. Olaf and Carleton's appetites for this stuff and how they might be incorporating this into their own work. But for right now, we're going to take a break and come back at about 11 o'clock Central. And in the meantime, folks, please, take whatever break you need, but feel free to add your questions of our panelists into the chat. I have a few questions to get us rolling once we come back, but this session is really about answering your questions and deepening your understanding of the practice of deconstruction. So we'll start up again at about 11:01. We'll say, how's that? Thanks. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to dive into some Q&A for the next little bit here. I want to thank our panelists again for sharing their unique perspectives and experiences. I think it highlights that a lot of different people in different types of, or in different sectors are working on advancing deconstruction, working on advancing more sustainable building and waste management practices. So whoever you are, wherever you're coming from, you have a role in this. I just want to, I appreciate that from all of you. I want to kick us off by asking all of our panelists, it's a big question, I guess, but each in your own world, what are the biggest challenges to advancing deconstruction? What is the biggest thing we're up against? Is it policy? Is it funding? Is it training? Is it awareness? I know a lot of times in thinking like, how cool would it be if we had more deconstruction activity? There's a bit of a chicken or an egg argument, but in your own experiences and worlds, what are you fighting against right now? What are the biggest hurdles and obstacles? And I encourage those working in deconstruction here on the call as well to share your thoughts in the chat too. So anyone who wants to start, please feel free.
I'll jump in on that. And I think it is awareness. Carleton's a good example. You know, it had developed this really incredible climate action plan. It's in its, you know, kind of second iteration. And waste was the last thing it thought about. And out of waste, demolition was the last thing that it thought about. And I find that over and over again, where it's just not on the minds of people, even when it comes to climate action issues, to think early on about waste, let alone even think of demolition and deconstruction being part of it.
I would piggyback off of Matt and say there's two things that I see. Number one being awareness, and number two being funding. I was recently in Detroit Lakes at a home show, and we were trying to bring awareness to deconstruction. And everyone that walked by our table, they're like, "What is deconstruction?" And then once we kind of outlaid what it was and the comparison and the contrast to demolition and the waste diversion aspect, everyone thought it was a great idea. But again, they had no clue what it was. I mean, it was just a foreign concept. I will also talk in this, and I think also funding is an issue. In the metro, specifically in Hennepin County, where there are grants available to help offset the cost of deconstruction. Deconstruction is more expensive than demolition. And so when you see a lot more, we do a lot more, far more residential projects than we do commercial. And so depending upon the ability for the client to write off and get credit for the donation of the reclaimed building materials that was covered in the first panel discussion, you know, being able to incentivize and make monetary sense for the client to do deconstruction is a second hurdle.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both points. Awareness is an issue, and I don't know if anyone watches the do-it-yourself television shows and things where they try to reclaim different materials. It has gotten some traction, but once people realize the cost associated with it, they immediately turn tail because it's a much higher cost. So again, finding a way to incentivize it for folks, trying to make it, you know, cost effective for them to utilize that method is really going to be the key to changing the minds and changing the culture of the industry. But, you know, that starts with policy. And unfortunately, government works at the speed of government, and that's glacial at times, unfortunately. So, but having folks that are willing to engage that discussion, to just, you know, to really look at the facts, that's going to be valuable. Like I said, the next 10 years are going to be really telling, and I'd like to see it move faster, but I've been in government long enough to know that that's about the right speed. But the conversations are being had. There is discussions being done. These presentations are a fabulous way to get the information out there. But again, we're only hitting a small group. And what we need to hit is the industry at large, especially the construction industry, because that's where the change is going to happen. And the changes, they'll do whatever they want as long as they get paid. But the homeowners, the property owners, are the ones that have to understand what they're paying for and where the value is to them. And that's education. It's finding ways to incentivize it a little bit.
And I think also to tie into that, Colin, is what's on the backside of it. As we talked about before, it's what happens with those materials that are diverted from the landfill. And when people come into our warehouse, I affectionately refer to it as like Home Depot and Lowe's, Menards meet thrift. People come into our warehouse to buy these reclaimed building materials for a couple of reasons. One, we have deconstructed some very nice properties, and people are able to come in and get appliances and doors and windows at a fraction of what those items cost originally at retail. The second thing is people come into our warehouse if we're looking at homes that are of a certain vintage. Especially with our hardwood flooring. I mean, you can't go to Home Depot or Menards and buy new flooring to match the consistency of an older home. And so that's another piece of the awareness, letting people know that, there are outlets to buy reclaimed materials for your home that are like brand new. So that's another piece, is what's on the backside of deconstruction and getting people to really rethink their buying habits.
And if you've got a marketplace for the materials, I went back and reread the comments about the training burns. Those are spots where the homeowner's not paying for the burning of their home. And there has to be some deconstruction to get materials out, the prohibited materials out. So there's an opportunity to get in there and take things out, because they have to wait so many days from the time they apply for the permit till the time it can be burned. A lot of those houses are abandoned for a reason, but there is still a lot of good usable materials, and the quality of those older homes materials is at such a high value that if you've got a marketplace for it, I'm just thinking for Jason here to get, to make contacts with local fire departments, say, hey, if you're doing training burn, let us know where it's at. We'd like to come in there and maybe help you take some things out of there. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. I'm doing you a favor by helping you get stuff out. I'm also, getting opportunity to reuse some of these materials. So there is an avenue there, which isn't set with a time frame. There's no increased cost to anyone as far as the homeowner or the fire department goes. It'd be more on the contractor to invest their time and energy in getting that stuff out of there. But if they've got a marketplace for it, and again, building up that marketplace so people understand that this is a great spot to get things and find some of these really cool, ornate, we talked before about some of the carvings and the inlets or insets in some of these older houses. It's just amazing, the woodwork and the quality and craftsmanship that you just don't see much today unless you're paying a huge amount of money for it. That these old houses have, and they just get thrown into a landfill. It's extraordinarily sad.
Yep.
So,
related to that, I think one of the important things is we need to get better awareness with people about the real costs. That is to say, on paper, it looks like, just tearing it down is so much cheaper. But especially when you factor in reuse, for example, and the money that comes in from reuse, and when you especially factor in the energy costs of sourcing the materials rather than reusing the materials, then you're changing the game completely. At the National Convention, there was a remarkable presentation, a person, I think he's in Portland, Oregon, who now has his costs for deconstruction down to nearly the cost of demolition. And it's partially through working on efficiencies and how the deconstruction goes, making sure he has a reuse facility that's so loved that people are buying things readily from it. And he's spread that. I think in San Francisco, they've done some research and published paper on, the full cost of demolition and how it really almost matches up with deconstruction in real cost. So I think we need both better information on the costs, And also we need to start killing this notion that demolition is so much cheaper by bringing awareness of the real costs and the values that were just being talked about, of how, you know, certain materials just are better found in reuse sources.
You know, and what's interesting is, you know, we're talking about, you know, deconstruction versus demolition and the landfills. I think one of the problems is, you know, we are literally a disposable society. We're quick to dispose of something and to replace it. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times when we're looking at manufacturing, the life cycle of, you know, products aren't like they used to be, you know, as Colin was talking about with the intricate built-ins, and things are just not built to last. And so I think it's just a retraining of how we look at things, and again, how we consume goods, you know, not be so quick to throw stuff away. And when we buy, does it always have to be new? I mean, we can buy like new, or if not better, and save money.
Thank you all for that. I want to lift up a question from Terry in the chat, kind of along the lines of awareness, but for a particular group of people. Terry asked, how can we bring info on deconstructed building materials to architects' attention? If they were familiar with deconstruction, they could use those practices to maintain more buildings, just deconstructing the portions that need to be changed. And I think this is a huge opportunity, right? And even when architects are speccing rehab projects, incorporating more salvaged materials, understanding the value of that old growth wood, of the value of these you know, historic materials that you're describing, Jason. So, and thanks to Stephanie for chiming in about an example in San Antonio, where a lot of awesome work is happening. And so I wanted to throw that to the panel though, too. You know, certain, I think, sectors, certain types of professionals have a different role to play in this work. How can we communicate the value of this? Perhaps you're not interfacing with architects as much, but how do we sort of, you know, tailor our information to different groups of people and get them at the table to be considering this? I also wanted to mention to Terry that if you Google anything around design for deconstruction, you know, the AIA here in Minnesota has done a little bit of programming on it. I think some folks, Melissa from MPCA and Olivia from Hennepin County, presented at the most recent AIA, American Institute of Architects Minnesota conference last year, kind of trying to get more of this conversation happening at that level. So for your reference.
I will start. I don't know that I have the answer to the question, but the question is legitimate. Yesterday, I actually fielded a call from an architect who knew nothing about deconstruction, but their client, in discussing their upcoming project, wanted, you know, introduce the concept of deconstruction to the architect, and the architect reached out to us to kind of talk through that. And so I had connected her with Jason Burble, who was on the panel last week, or was it 2 weeks ago? Last week? Anyways, the previous panel. So the question does have merit. And, you know, I think, Natalie, as you just talked about, you know, getting in front of groups of architects to, you know, further this discussion would be a start. But it definitely is a legitimate question, because you don't know what you don't know.
The other issue is the architects are taking guidance from their clients. And so trying to get the clients to understand that there's value here, so they can, again, as Jason just found out, they went to the architect and said, hey, I find value here. I want you to look into this. But getting the property people, the owners and those folks involved in understanding how it's valuable. But if the architects had that knowledge, they can also explain to them too. So it's kind of a two-way street where you need them both to be kind of in sync with what's going on. But again, getting in front of groups of people, getting on, you know, involved in their circles, as it were, in order to disseminate some information to them and share with them some of the value. Some of the positives that come from this is hugely important. But I don't know how you get in front of the property owners. Well, that's a different animal unless you get into the realtor sector, and I've done that. That's not as much fun. I won't lie.
Getting to the architects is valuable in terms of timeline. We have a project here in Northfield that is a carbon-free housing project for transient individuals and extreme low income individuals, and it's replacing a facility that took old sort of cabins and revamped them, and now we're going to have a much better and bigger facility. But when we suddenly realized that we had done all of this, people had done all of this planning for carbon free, but nobody had thought about demolition, we suddenly raced to try and get demolition right. I mean, deconstruction right before the demolition was about to occur. And it was partially just too late. We couldn't really get meaningful deconstruction because our timeline was too short. And so architects can alert their clients to, be thinking about this and setting it up in a timely way.
Another thing with the role where the architects can play is actually, again, maybe even not even related to deconstruction, but on the backside of deconstruction, and then that relationship with the contractor. A great example is our mixed-use building, Great River Landing, where we house our admin and then the men that we serve within the model of our organization. The architect was big into reuse. And so when the design build portion of planning for the building was put in place, he wanted to use reclaimed materials throughout. And what benefited that project was he was familiar with our organization. And so it was very intentional that the materials that our men reclaimed from deconstruction projects went into the building that they were going to be living in. And so, that the whole circle, whether it's, planning, the project to deconstruct before the rehab or using reused materials, is a great reason to get architects involved.
Thank you all. I want to mention a question from Jody that popped up a little bit ago, potentially looking to sell the vintage kitchen cabinets from their parents' 1948 house in Northwest Wisconsin, looking for recommendations where to list it or how to find a buyer. So I know that next week we have Ian Anderson from Architectural Antiques as one of our panelists who can speak to, he works at one of the premier, I think, like really high-end architectural salvage shops in the Twin Cities, which we have quite a lot of here. We're so lucky to have access to that. But Jason, maybe you can chime in, or others, about potential tax deductions or sales of some of these products. So
that's funny you said it. So I'm gonna say, well, we are a nonprofit. We don't buy stuff, but if we could, if the tax deduction was favorable, we could talk about making a new home for those cabinets in our reuse warehouse, and we'll find a new home for them. So yes, and so in terms of, consignment and selling them, I don't really have a lot of answers for that, but we do take in a lot of stuff like that on donation, and it is a charitable contribution. So if you are able to itemize, that could be a route that you may want to look at. My contact information should be somewhere around here. Feel free to reach out to me and we can have that discussion.
I think this also ties into the comment that Terry has, and that is, I fully agree, this is something I came to be more aware of in the project I was just telling about, that having a list, like a municipality or even more broadly of where our reuse sites is invaluable. And especially since, different ones have different regulations in terms of what they'll accept or what they're geared towards. And it does change And so that's one of the problems of sort of creating a list that gets dated very quickly. And there may be a greater use of having one more local to your area, a list more local to your area, or searchable by area. But, you know, a number of Habitat for Humanity organizations have reuse sites, and there are various ones that it would be good for people to have ready access to. Where can I take things, and particularly of different types of things?
I know a lot of landfills have started pulling out materials from the waste stream, mostly furniture, not so much construction materials. They have started pulling things out where they've set up little warehouses on their landfill sites for people to browse through and look for stuff, bicycles, furniture, lamps, whatever it might be. And a lot of them have started, well, a significant amount of them started doing that with paints as well, where they have a chemical warehouse where you can come in and get paints and different things that have come in. So landfills have started, but they haven't got to the point where they've started looking at construction type materials yet. But I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes something they become interested in as the need becomes higher. People start asking questions, but it's, again, there's a lot of potential here. It's just changing that mindset of the consumers and the people that are designing things. And I know someone mentioned here that, you know, the planning phase, getting this involved early on so there's time for it, so that the plans are made ahead of time and it's not a scramble. It's not it's too late for us to do that because our time frame's this now. The discussions need to be happening very, very early in the planning phase.
And Colin, just to kind of piggyback on that, and that was one of the, you know, as you talk about landfills and transfer stations, that was one of the things that we've done over the last couple of years. We had started with a pilot program, and now we're moving into a full-fledged partnership with Becker County. We had hired someone to be stationed at Becker County, and we provided him with a four-wheeler, and he would tool around the different sites of the transfer station, and you'd be surprised at how many building material items he pulled out: doors, windows, 2x4s. And what was crazy about the 2x4s, this is when at the time the national average for a 2x4 was approaching $10, and people were throwing them away. And to your point also, it was the household items. And that's a little bit different than what we were used to at our warehouse site, because the majority of it is building materials and not home goods. And so it was kind of a different shift, but it was, you know, interesting how when people bring stuff to our warehouse, they're very intentional about it being diverted from the landfill. And when people come in to buy, they realize that it was reused. But it was interesting that when we set up those pop-up sales in Detroit Lakes, that people were going to the landfill and actually buying stuff that they knew just came out of the trash. And so it's really interesting that you know, people, you know, when they're looking, you know, from a thrift perspective to consume items and buy, if they see value, they're not afraid that it was, you know, like the old saying, one man's junk is the next man's treasure. They're not afraid to buy these items because, again, they see value. And on the flip side, again, like I said, you know, we're such a disposable society. You know, someone was like, it's missing a knob, so I'm gonna throw it away. And the next person's like, this was originally $400. I'll buy a new knob, or I don't care if it doesn't have a knob, I'm buying that. So yeah, you're right.
And I see the discussion over here about lead. You know, most of the contractors have what's considered the EPA's renovation, repair, and painting program certification now, so they can do some lead work and remove some of that from older materials. So that shouldn't be the determining factor as well. There might be lead there. There are ways to get rid of it. There are ways to handle it safely. And again, it becomes changing that mindset of, okay, I like this. I need to include this step now to get that lead taken care of before it gets brought into my home or before it gets brought to construction site. But there are ways, and there are cost-effective ways to deal with it. Again, it's just a matter of planning ahead, understanding what you're working with, and making that step in the process to deal with it. But yeah, anything, I would say 70 is when they banned lead paint. I always say anything prior to 80, because, you know, they used the last leftovers that they had in stock. They didn't just throw that away. They used it till it was all gone. They couldn't get any more. So I always look at anything pre-80 should be considered suspect, and it's glazings, varnishes, stains, as well as paints. They use lead materials in them. So even if it's a wood grain product, it should be tested or looked at. And again, it's just a matter of adding that step in the process. But again, great materials. I don't want that to be the one factor that turns people away from it.
That's a great point. I think there's some demystifying that needs to happen around lead safety. Obviously, it's a concern. I see Madeline. Yeah, I would cry too if we threw out all that old wood, because with the proper preparation and protective equipment, it is possible to, you know, strip that paint carefully, safely, and be left with a really high quality product, much better than what you're picking up at Home Depot. So, and I wonder, Colin, actually, if you can speak a little bit more to, you know, some of the public health implications of lead and asbestos around, you know, demolitions that are happening. I know we talked a little bit about this. There are studies now that link rampant residential demolitions to lead poisoning in kids and that sort of thing. It's a very serious concern and potentially something that more careful deconstruction could help with.
Well, just to give reference, we review all the demolition notifications that come in for the state of Minnesota. And last year we had 1,881 original notifications, meaning that the first notifications that came in. We had a total of 3,289 total. So that was originals and amendments. But again, we don't regulate the residential. So there's a lot going on in the residential sector that we're not aware of. And because there's no requirement for inspections and removal prior to demolition, we do see an increase in lead risks, especially in urban areas where the houses are so close together. Major cities have that issue. So that's why we see Ramsey and Hennepin County looking at ordinances to try and get that taken care of. Now, asbestos is a bigger issue to me because it travels so much faster, but it's a naturally occurring mineral. So standing on the corner of a busy street in a busy city, you're going to be breathing a lot of asbestos dust from the brake pads alone. Lead tends to settle out. It's heavy, so it settles out usually within 10 feet of the work area, but it's easily tracked. And the problem is you have kids in these residential areas that are running around neighborhoods, playing in everyone's yard, because that's what kids do. And they're tracking that back to their homes. They're not washing their hands, so they're eating with dirty fingers. And that's where you see that increase in lead exposure. But it's an issue with demolition. Of course it is. Asbestos is one of the bigger concerns that I know the cities seem to have because of the way that it migrates. It just travels so quickly and it's easy to get out. But lead is an issue, and doing deconstruction allows for a safer method of taking things apart, because you're taking it down piece by piece instead of just smashing it all in. Smashing it all in, obviously there's a higher debris field. There's more risk for things to get loosened and get removed. Whereas deconstruction is a slower process and more technical. I say technical, it's really, I mean, you're just taking things apart, but it's a slower process, and it does remove some of that smash and bash activity. But it's an issue. And, you know, how do you combat that? The best way is to, you know, notifications around the neighborhood to let people know, hey, this is happening. Using water, especially water, to control the dust fields with, whether it be asbestos or lead. Using water is the best way to control those contaminants. But then the cleanup is just as important when you're done, to make sure you've cleaned up that area. You've really done a good job of making sure there's nothing left behind when you leave. But it's, yeah, we see it, like I said, a lot more in urban areas where you've got houses that are close together. Any big city where, you know, I'm 6'2" and I can lay down and touch one house and my feet can touch the other house. Like, they're so close together, and you're seeing these demolitions in these residential areas. And it is extremely concerning from a public health point of view and from an environmental point of view as well.
You know, Colin, one thing, you know, you had talked a couple of times about the skill involved with deconstruction. You're right. It's not, it's not a finite skill, but there is still a skill to it. Because one of the things that we have to do consistently as we're bringing new men into our model and training them is, the patience to take something apart. Because, when we talk about, the impact, when you're doing what you're doing and you're not really thinking about how it impacts someone else, our guys are thinking, oh, we got these deadlines and we have to get this stuff out. They're not thinking about what it looks like once we get it back to the warehouse. Because if they're not handling the cabinetry and the woodwork with care, and we get it back and we can't sell it, I mean, we haven't really done anything. I mean, it's we can't sell it, we can't reuse it. It's still going back into the landfill. So there is something to that, being methodical and showing care when removing those items.
Again, taking the time, it's a time thing more than anything else, where they have to have the time and the ability to take their time to do it. Because like you said, if you damage it, you've now wasted your time because you can't do anything with it. But yeah, I mean, it is one of those things where the training is important, so they understand that the importance of taking their time and how to remove nails that are turned sideways, how to do some of that stuff that a regular construction worker go there with their pry bar and just pop it off the wall, and who cares? So there is some training that's involved, and it's important. It's valuable training that's needed, but it's not something that takes months and months and months. It's just a matter of taking the time to actually help them understand the value of it. And that, I mean, again, there's a cost there to the employer, but there's value there if you can get it done correctly.
Exactly.
I want to switch gears a little bit and ask a question of Matt as a self-described citizen volunteer. Can you talk a bit about getting involved in, a smaller community in Northfield? How would you encourage other caring citizens to speak up and be involved? I know a lot of communities right now either have climate action plans in place or are working really hard on getting some pretty ambitious ones in place. What is your, encouragement for folks who want to see some of this change happen in their own communities?
So, I think there are many people who are very concerned about what's happening with the environment and global warming in particular. And so one way to channel that energy, especially the frustrations around that energy, is to say our community is going to do what we can. In many ways, we had attempted this before in Northfield, but that's what really galvanized, particularly as the federal government under Donald Trump began to say, we're not going to go in this direction any longer. That galvanized a lot of communities. I think Bloomberg was leading this charge that, okay, let's start at the local level and build outward rather than waiting for the federal level to have things that we have to do. So encouraging people to take their energy and their frustrations and band together with other community members. And then also, what we did is we started researching what have other communities have in terms of climate action plans. And recently, 100% people, Kate Knuth wrote up a report that you can get at the 100% campaign website on basically just listing that there are 15 communities in Minnesota at the time of her report, which was just recently released, that have climate action plans. I will say our whole zero waste plan came out of EPA and the resources the EPA has in terms of model zero waste plans. So the task doesn't have to be as hard as it might seem, and it's a good way to channel the interests of people really concerned about climate and the environment.
And I would backpedal or piggyback on that idea that it's easier to start local and get things changed on a community level, even if it's neighborhood by neighborhood, but starting small and working out from there, you'll get more done than trying to change at the highest level from the very beginning. The state works slow. We're not quite as slow as federal, but we're much slower than county, and we're slower than cities. So if you can start locally and say, hey, we'd like to see this, like to see these changes happen now, where we want to see a deconstruction model for properties in our community. Let's make an ordinance that this is something that we want to look at, or how do we change that there? And building from those grassroots movements, you'll see a lot more movement at a state level where there's more people saying, hey, all these communities are doing it. Why aren't we doing it? And we consider ourselves a very progressive state in Minnesota, that we're on the forefront of these things, but it does take it. It grinds. The government wheel grinds slow. So doing things at a smaller level will get much more traction and really push at a higher level to get things done too. So I agree with that sentiment that start local, think global.
I should add that one of the things that we're trying to parlay with what Northfield and as a result Rice County is doing is also to break down the city-rural divide that exists. It's partially a political fabrication, but as people in Minnesota know, it's become quite intense, and particularly around environmental matters, where a lot of politicians want people to believe rural people don't want all of the regulations and environmental concerns that the urban people want. So don't make state regulations that are tight, especially on waste and hazardous materials. Let us dispose of things how we know best how to do it. And I don't think they're really speaking for people who I don't think want to have hazardous waste handled poorly in outstate areas. And Becker's example of the landfill is a good example. In fact, they price things very low on purpose. They actually charge the landfill fee for the things that come in, because technically that's what's happening. And then they sell the things at extremely low prices. And they have people coming in from all over the region who then take them to their own reuse site and mark up the price. But Becker's doing that for that very reason on purpose. The University of Minnesota does the same thing. They have an incredible reuse facility that's open to the public. And their objective is just to get it reused, not to make money, And so they're happy when reuse people are coming into their site. So one thing to think about is, we can try and make this maybe a break even or bring in some money for it. But what we're really doing is making sure this reuse gets going in a ripple effect as well. And I think outstate people just need to be woken up to this opportunities and looking at the values they really hold as opposed to the values that politicians are trying to impose on them.
There is a sentiment out there that it's my property, I can do what I want. But I have found that interacting and communicating in a very respectful manner usually gets some results where they're willing to listen. I mean, they just aren't aware of the changes that are happening, why it's important to them, why it impacts them. And once those things are explained, usually you get a pretty good change in attitude. But it is again, it's very different when you get outside any of the major cities, whether it be, Mankato, Rochester, the metro area, Duluth. We liken it to the Wild West, where anything goes because there's just not a lot of oversight on farms and in those rural areas. And they've always done things a certain way, and changing that mindset is hard sometimes. But having discussions, whether they be with communities or individuals alone, usually yields results. They're usually educated. They love their land. They love the environment. But they've always done things a certain way, and so helping them understand why what they're doing can be changed and done a different way that is better for everybody. Tends to lead to positive results. I mean, there are people that still just kind of don't care. They're going to do things the way they wanted to, and that's the way it's going to be. But there is unfortunately, a significant rift in how government is viewed and how government interaction is viewed. So it's a tightrope sometimes you got to walk, especially as a government regulator who does enforcement. No one likes to see me coming on their property, whether it be rural or urban. So it is important to always be professional, have some facts, and open the conversation. And that's basically what it is. It's a dialogue. Instead of a discussion, it's a dialogue where we're both exchanging ideas and thoughts. So
it seems a common thread here is growing awareness, building awareness. And so I wonder if folks on the call here today, can help me as somebody in charge of getting information and education materials out into the public? What do you need to be talking to your community leaders? What do you need to be talking, to your architect on your next home remodel about the possibilities of deconstruction? One of the things we're working on at Rethos is really building out our digital resources on our webpage so that you have a one-stop shop for, a list of local salvage shops, and you have links to the deconstruction grants that exist in our communities, and all of that. But I love to be able to hand folks the information they need to feel confident in making a case, making an argument for something important to them. So whether that's data, whether that's case studies, I would love to know. So please do share. And please do ask any other questions of our panelists while we have their ear. I wanted to toss something at Jason too, because in my conception, Better Futures is a really big player in Minnesota here. And we're starting to see some other deconstruction companies emerge, although we also know that some contractors already incorporate some deconstruction into their work that might kind of be less obvious to the naked eye. But I wonder, what do you see as the future of the deconstruction contracting field? Where do we need to go? What do we need to do to support more companies, train more folks in this work?
That's a great question. I think, obviously with the future, there's a great opportunity for growth. And as you said, there are more entrants in the field. There are more contractors who are now taking on some of those things. I think, one of the things, moving that forward again is just, the opportunities from a cost perspective. And I think also for the contractors or even the other, practitioners of deconstruction is the outlet. What are they going to do with those materials? One of the things that Colin said is, being able to have that marketplace to sell those goods or, create the customers to buy those goods is going to be an issue. And so I think part of it is going to be partnership, for us to partner with other deconstruction companies or contractors for them to, if they don't have either the online marketplace or the brick and mortar to sell those goods, for them to not look at us as a threat or vice versa, and be able to maybe bring in some of their, the deconstructed, reused, reclaimed materials. And we've done a little bit of that. Patrina, who's with Birch Group, she did a deconstruction project, and she reached out to us to see if we wanted to come and grab some of those materials from her project, because she just didn't have the capacity to sell all those items, and we did that. So I think there's some opportunity for that as well, to kind of create partnership as well as joint work.
Thank you for that. Not seeing any more questions in the chat, I want to allow each of our panelists to offer their final words of wisdom to our group. Whatever you think. I think I encouraged everybody last week to share, if somebody goes out, if everybody here on the call goes out and has one conversation with one friend or family member about deconstruction, what do you encourage them to say to build up this critical mass of folks who are caring about and advocating for deconstruction? So I offer you, I'll let you all share a little bit more. Folks, please feel free to add any more questions in the chat. If not, we can let you go a little earlier than planned.
I would say there's value, there's benefit, and there's opportunity. It's the future. This is the way things are shifting on not only a statewide scale, but a nationwide scale. So getting on the front side of it, being progressive about it is always going to be the best way to go.
Yeah, and I would say I'm just a regular citizen. I was completely unaware of the importance and value of deconstruction. And it's a very exciting way to tackle some of our environmental problems and to live with a better attitude towards materials in the world we live in.
I would say, I would kind of echo some of the sentiments of both Colin and Matt, that, you know, it's exciting and there's opportunity. Whether you're on the backside of the deconstruction project and you're buying reclaimed and reused materials, or if you are looking to do a partial or full deconstruction of your home, is that, you know, the stuff that's inside your house can find a new home. So again, you know, be excited about the opportunity.
I wanted to add in as well something that hasn't been brought up and that Jason can speak to more. One of the reasons why Carleton decided to push in the direction it did was the environmental justice dimension of hiring Better Futures. So it explicitly decided to go with Better Futures because one of the things Better Futures does is employ people who have just come out of prison. And even one of the financial things we haven't talked about is the employment opportunities that deconstruction gives and job training in this growing field of environmental concerns. But a social justice dimension of it is also very important.
Matt, I'm glad you brought that up. So, you know, I was a little remiss in talking about Better Futures when I first started. So for those of you who are not really familiar with Better Futures, we are a nonprofit, and our mission primarily was to provide stable housing and employment for men coming out of incarceration. And so we currently have about 30 men that are working in our enterprise. And in our enterprise, we have 5 different business lines. And the 2 main drivers of that business, or those business lines, are deconstruction and our reuse warehouse. And so a lot of the men that we have working for us in our model, for some of these men, they've never had jobs before. And so to Colin's point, in terms of building up skills, so we have transitional workforce development. And so deconstruction made a lot of sense when we were putting our model together, from the environmental standpoint, the environmental stewardship of, you know, the environmental, you know, lessening the impact on the environment, but also being able to train these men up to give them some basic skills that they could then now take in and out into the world. And so a lot of them had never used hand and power tools before. And so we were introducing them to a skill set that was transferable. And so that is a big thing. You know, a lot of our men, again, like I said, before coming to Better Futures, they did not have a job. And as we try to help provide workplace stamina and build that up, and then get them out into the workforce is a big component for us.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Matt, thank you for bringing that up, because I failed to do so earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, Better Futures model is amazing, and everybody should know about you guys. So thanks for sharing that. Well, great. I want to say thank you again to Colin, to Matt, and to Jason for an excellent panel and discussion. Folks on the call, please, I hope you join us next week for our 3rd and final panel in this series. I think we'll let you all go and enjoy your lunch. So thank you all so much.
All right. Thank you.